On the evening of January 31st, 2026, an 84-year-old grandmother named Nancy Guthrie had dinner with her daughter Annie at a home not far from her own in the Catalina foothills, a quiet, sun-baked neighborhood tucked into the hills north of Tucson, Arizona. She played games, laughed, and did everything a grandmother does on an ordinary Saturday night. At approximately 9:45 in the evening, her family dropped her off at her front door. She went inside. The garage door closed. The lights eventually dimmed. And then, somewhere in the dark hours before sunrise, Nancy Guthrie simply vanished. She left behind her phone. She left behind her medications her heart depended on for survival. She left behind a glass of water and the ordinary artifacts of a woman who fully intended to wake up the next morning. But she never came to church. When her friends and family came to check on her, they found drops of her own blood on the front porch and a silence so complete it had weight. In that moment, the quiet neighborhood became the center of one of the most haunting, most scrutinized missing persons cases in modern American history. To understand the full gravity of what happened in that house, you have to understand who Nancy Ellen Guthrie was before she became a case number. Born Nancy Ellen Long on January 27, 1942, in Fort Wright, Kentucky, she was a woman shaped by decades of Arizona sun, community faith, and personal resilience. She had lived in the Tucson area for more than 50 years, having moved there with her family in the early 1970s. She was a parishioner at St. Philip's in the Hills Parish, a constant presence in the pews on Sunday mornings. Her faith was not performative, it was the steady current running beneath the whole of her life. She raised 3 children, Savannah, Annie, and Cameron. She lost her husband, Charles Guthrie, when he died at the age of 49 during a mining exploration trip in Mexico in 1988. That loss could have broken her. Instead, it forged something tougher. According to those who knew her, she was, in the words of a family friend, sharp as a tack, a woman who never missed a birthday card, and whose laugh came easy and often. She was not a fragile woman who had retreated from a world. She was an active, present, deeply social grandmother who had simply, quietly, built a life of beautiful routine in the desert hills of southern Arizona. And that routine, that predictability, that clockwork pattern of a life well ordered, it would ultimately be used against her. The timeline of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, as it has been carefully reconstructed by investigators and reported by multiple news organizations, is both precise and deeply unsettling. On the night of Saturday, January 31st, she returned home at approximately 9:45 p.m. after spending the evening with her daughter Annie. The garage door closed behind her. What happened between that moment and the early morning hours of February 1st remains, as of this writing, the central mystery of the entire investigation. What investigators do know is chilling. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker, a device that monitored and maintained her heart rhythm, stopped syncing with her Apple devices at approximately 2:28 in the morning. That timestamp has been described by authorities as the moment she was physically taken out of range of her own home, carried, driven, moved into a world beyond the reach of her own digital signature. She did not go willingly. The blood on the front porch confirmed that. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos would later stand before cameras and state with quiet authority, she did not leave on her own. We know that. There was no sign of a struggle inside, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, just the calculated absence of a woman who had been there one moment and was not the next. When her friends arrived the following morning for a virtual church service, she never missed and found silence where there should have been her voice. They raised the alarm. By noon on February 1st, 2026, the Pima County Sheriff's Department had begun what would become a massive, multi-agency search operation. In any modern kidnapping investigation, the first question law enforcement asks is a simple one. What did the cameras see? In the Catalina foothills, a neighborhood of comfortable, security-conscious homes, the answer was both revelatory and maddeningly incomplete. The doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's home, a Nest device, had captured footage of a man approaching the property. The FBI described him as a male of average build, standing approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall. He was wearing a black face mask, a pair of gloves, and a black 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack, the kind sold at Walmart stores across the country. He was seen in one of the most haunting sequences of evidence in the case, appearing to tamper with the doorbell camera itself, placing branches in front of lens, obscuring the view, neutralizing the very eye that was supposed to protect the woman inside. The FBI's special agent in charge of the Phoenix office, Hythe Yankee, would later release these images to the public, and Savannah Guthrie would share them on her Instagram with 3 words that carried the weight of 100 prayers: "We believe she is still alive. Bring her home." But beyond the silhouette of this masked figure, the cameras offered little else. Investigators from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, working alongside the FBI's evidence response team, reviewed thousands of hours of surveillance footage from residences, businesses, and government agencies across the neighborhood and surrounding area. The process was described by law enforcement sources as painstaking, often requiring footage to be slowed down frame by frame to search for any fragment of meaning. The desert, it turned out, kept its own counsel. By the first days of February, the investigation had taken on a scale rarely seen in a missing persons case. The multi-agency response drew, in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Pima County Sheriff's Department, U.S. Customs and Border Protection with its fleet of drones and K-9 units, and search and rescue teams that began working the desert terrain in organized grid patterns. Investigators canvassed Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood with the kind of thoroughness that leaves no stone unturned, speaking with residents, requesting access to private security systems, and searching out buildings and brush. An investigator was photographed using a long pole to probe an underground tank behind Nancy's home. Nothing was considered too small, too peripheral, too unlikely. Then came what initially appeared to be a breakthrough. Investigators located a black glove near Nancy Guthrie's home, approximately 2 miles from the property, that appeared to visually match the gloves worn by the suspect captured on the doorbell camera footage. The FBI announced a recovery of this glove publicly, and forensic testing confirmed it contained DNA from an unidentified male. The profile was submitted to CODIS, the national DNA database containing profiles from millions of convicted offenders and arrestees across the United States. It returned no match. The trail went cold as quickly as it had warmed. Then, in a development that further complicated the forensic picture, the Pima County Sheriff's Department later confirmed that those gloves had been traced by DNA to a local restaurant worker who was determined to be entirely unconnected to the investigation. The gloves, so promising at first, had belonged to someone who had simply worked in the area and discarded them. It was one of several dead ends that characterized the early weeks of the search. Not for lack of effort, but for the simple, maddening reason that whoever took Nancy Guthrie appeared to have moved with exceptional care and deliberateness, among the most significant forensic developments to emerge in the investigation, and one that speaks directly to the premeditated nature of what happened on the night of January 31st, was the discovery and examination of a damaged utility box located around the corner from Nancy Guthrie's home. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed to NBC News that investigators were actively examining this piece of infrastructure in connection with the case. The significance of the utility box lies in what happened in the neighborhood around the time of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, a localized internet outage. Neighbors in the Catalina foothills area told reporters from News Nation that their home's security camera footage from the night in question was either missing or marked not available. Multiple residents described unusual connectivity problems during the hours that Nancy is believed to have been taken. Federal investigators began examining whether this internet service disruption was tied directly to the abduction, whether someone had deliberately tampered with the utility box to create a blind spot in the neighborhood's web of surveillance. If confirmed, it would represent an extraordinary degree of operational planning on the part of whoever took Nancy Guthrie. It would suggest that this was not a crime of opportunity, not a random act of violence against a vulnerable woman who happened to be alone. It would mean that the perpetrator or perpetrators had studied the neighborhood, identified the infrastructure that powered its security systems, and systematically disabled it in advance. Experts involved in the investigation, according to published reports, believe that the person responsible may not have acted alone, and that the possibility of accomplices cannot be ruled out. The first indication that someone was making a financial demand for Nancy Guthrie's return came not through a private channel, not through a backroom negotiation between the family and their captors, but through the media. Multiple news organizations reported receiving ransom notes in connection with her disappearance. The CBS affiliate KOLD-TV in Tucson confirmed on February 2nd that it had received a letter demanding payment for Guthrie's release. TMZ also reported receiving a ransom communication. The station KGUN reported receiving a note demanding $6 million in Bitcoin, with a deadline set for the evening of Monday, February 9th. The decision to route these communications through media outlets rather than directly to the family was a calculated move, one that stripped the Guthrie family of the privacy that hostage negotiations traditionally require and forced them to process their most desperate moments under a global spotlight. FBI Special Agent in Charge Hythe Yankee addressed the ransom question directly, making clear that while law enforcement provides advice and recommendations, any decision about whether to pay is ultimately the family's alone. The Guthrie family found themselves navigating not only the terror of a mother's disappearance, but also the murky, treacherous world of cryptocurrency demands and unverified communications. When the February 9th deadline came and passed, there was no exchange. There was no proof of life. There was only silence. Then the picture grew even more complicated. On February 5th, federal agents arrested a California man who had sent what were determined to be imposter ransom messages, a man attempting to exploit the family's anguish for personal gain. In a high-profile case that had captured the attention of the entire country, predators of a different kind had gathered, and the FBI was forced to fight on two fronts at once, hunting for the real perpetrators while sorting through the noise of those seeking to capitalize on the tragedy. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most recognized faces in American morning television, the co-host of NBC's Today Show, a journalist who has interviewed presidents and anchored the coverage of some of the most consequential news events of the past decade. None of it prepared her for this. When her mother disappeared, Savannah stepped away from her broadcasting duties, including coverage of the 2026 Winter Olympics opening ceremonies, to join the search and be present with her family. She became, in those weeks, something more than a television anchor. She became a daughter performing the most agonizing act any child can perform, which is to stand before the world and beg for someone to bring her mother home. Her video statements on Instagram, recorded from what appeared to be ordinary domestic settings, often flanked by her siblings Annie and Cameron, were watched by millions. In her first major public statement on February 4th, she addressed the possibility that her mother was being held captive. "We live in a world where voices and images are easily manipulated," she said, sitting alongside her brother and sister. "We need to know without a doubt that she is alive and that you have her. We want to hear from you, and we are ready to listen. Please reach out to us." She spoke of her mother's health with a heartbreaking directness that cut through the formality of a public statement. She lives in constant pain. She is without any medicine. She needs it to survive. She needs it not to suffer. On February 7th, after the family indicated they had received a message from someone claiming to be connected to her mother's disappearance, Savannah appeared again, composed, determined, her voice holding steady under impossible weight. "We receive your message and we understand," she said. "We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is very valuable to us and we will pay." When the February 9th deadline passed without resolution, she returned to Instagram with a plea that extended beyond whoever held her mother to anyone, anywhere, who might hold a piece of the puzzle. "We are at an hour of desperation and we need your help. We believe our mom is still out there." On February 24th, she announced that the family was offering a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy Guthrie's recovery, a move that, according to law enforcement sources, generated approximately 1,500 additional tips to the FBI within days, with more than 750 of them deemed credible enough to pursue. President Donald Trump, speaking to reporters aboard Air Force One, weighed in on the case with uncharacteristic optimism. "I think we're doing very well on that regard. We have some clues, I think, that are very strong, and I think we could have some answers coming up fairly soon." The White House posted information about Nancy Guthrie on its social media accounts, urging the public to report relevant information. Trump reportedly called Savannah Guthrie directly on February 4th, offering additional federal resources and expressing hope for her mother's safe return. The involvement of the White House elevated the case to a level of national urgency rarely associated with a missing persons investigation. And yet the attention, as is so often the case with high-profile disappearances, became both an asset and a liability. The FBI's tip line and the Pima County Sheriff's Department were flooded with thousands of calls from members of the public. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed receiving over 50,000 calls in connection with the case. Some of those calls represented legitimate sightings or credible information. Others were the product of internet speculation, amateur theorizing, and the dark instinct some people have to insert themselves into other people's tragedies. Internet content creators live-streamed from outside the Guthrie home. Speculation about the family's involvement spread across social media platforms without a shred of evidentiary basis. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos was eventually compelled to address this directly, not to announce a breakthrough, but to defend a grieving family against the cruelty of an audience that had confused a real human tragedy for a form of entertainment that, as the investigation extended into its third and fourth weeks, the geographic scope of the search expanded significantly. Due to the proximity of Tucson to the U.S.-Mexico border, a detail that investigators treated as operationally relevant from early in the case, U.S. Border Patrol agents and Mexican law enforcement authorities were briefed and asked